In the heart of Gaza, on a Friday afternoon in August 2004, a silent and deadly operation unfolded within the sacred walls of a mosque. This mission would become one of the most audacious and controversial assassinations in modern intelligence history, showcasing a chilling blend of patience, technology, and ruthless determination. The story reveals the extreme lengths taken to neutralize a top terrorist commander and the profound ethical questions such actions leave in their wake. Gaza, Friday, August 9, 2004. The afternoon prayer gathered hundreds of believers in the Al-Amari mosque, their voices merging as they knelt in rows facing Mecca. Among them was Salah Shahada, a senior military commander for Hamas, responsible for orchestrating attacks that claimed the lives of dozens of Israelis. A man who used the sanctity of religious sites as a shield from Israeli operations. No one in the mosque suspected that a Mossad agent had entered, disguised as a worshipper, carrying a special weapon designed to deliver death without sound or visible wound, allowing the assassin to dissolve into the crowd before anyone realized the target had been struck. The operation to eliminate Salah Shahada inside the mosque stands as one of the most daring and contentious killings in Mossad's history. An operation that demanded not only exceptional technical capabilities, but also a willingness to carry out a lethal action in a religious place during prayer. A decision that broke cultural and religious norms and risked triggering massive political repercussions if Israeli involvement was discovered, or if the operation led to casualties among the attending faithful. The decision to proceed with such an operation reflected the assessment of Israeli intelligence that Shahada represented such a grave threat that his elimination justified the risks and potential diplomatic consequences that would follow. Salah Shahada was born in Gaza in 1961 and joined Hamas in the late 1980s during the First Intifada, rising within the organization's military wing to become one of its most effective and dangerous commanders. Shahada was personally responsible for building Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza, recruiting and training militants, organizing weapons smuggling, and planning attacks on Israeli military forces and civilian populations. By the early 2000s, Israeli intelligence attributed Shahada's involvement to dozens of attacks that killed over 100 Israelis, making him one of the highest priority targets for Israeli counter-terrorism operations. Israeli military and intelligence services repeatedly attempted to eliminate Shahada using various methods, including airstrikes, artillery bombardment, and special forces operations. But these attempts failed either due to insufficient intelligence on his whereabouts or because Shahada's security measures prevented Israeli forces from reaching him before he moved to a new location. Shahada was known for frequently changing locations, never sleeping in the same place for more than 1 or 2 nights. He used numerous bodyguards who screened visitors and maintained perimeter security, and communicated through couriers rather than electronic means that Israeli intelligence could intercept or track. The task of eliminating Shahada was complicated by his habit of using civilian facilities, including schools, hospitals, and mosques, as meeting places and temporary shelters. Correctly calculating that Israeli military forces would be reluctant to strike such locations due to the risk of civilian casualties, and the political costs that would result from attacks on culturally or religiously sensitive sites. This practice of using human shields and protected sites for military purposes violated international humanitarian law, but was an effective security strategy from Hamas's perspective, as it exploited Israel's reluctance to cause collateral damage. And because any Israeli strike that led to civilian casualties would provoke international condemnation that Hamas could use for propaganda purposes. Israeli intelligence tracked Shahada's movements and routines for years, building a comprehensive profile of his habits, associates, security procedures, and psychology. Intelligence revealed that, despite cautious security methods, Shahada adhered to certain routines that could potentially be exploited, including regular attendance at Friday prayers in Gaza City mosques. Shahada visited different mosques on different weeks to avoid creating predictable patterns. But he considered attending Friday prayer a religious obligation he was unwilling to forego, even though it required him to be in public spaces where he could be vulnerable to Israeli operations. The idea of conducting an assassination inside a mosque during Friday prayer emerged during planning in mid-August 2004, when Mossad operational planners considered options for eliminating Shahada after previous attempts failed. The proposal was initially dismissed as too risky and too politically sensitive, but was revived when intelligence indicated Shahada would be present at prayer in a specific mosque on a particular date. Intelligence that provided a rare opportunity to know with certainty where the target would be at a specific time. The operational concept required solving several technical and tactical problems. First, the killing had to be carried out in a way that would not immediately alert the hundreds of other people in the mosque to an ongoing attack, since any overt violence would cause panic and likely result in the operative being caught or attacked by worshippers before he could escape. Second, the method of elimination had to be one that left no obvious evidence of Israeli involvement, since a killing inside a mosque would be controversial enough without proof that it was an Israeli operation, rather than the result of internal Hamas disputes or other causes. Third, the operative had to be able to enter the mosque without arousing suspicion from Hamas guards screening entrance, and had to be able to leave the mosque after carrying out the killing without being identified or detained. The weapon chosen for the operation was a specialized device that Israeli intelligence technical services developed specifically for covert assassinations, where conventional firearms would be too conspicuous or too noisy. The device was designed to deliver a lethal dose of a fast-acting chemical agent through skin contact, using a delivery mechanism that resembled an ordinary item, drawing no attention under casual observation. The chemical agent was based on nerve toxins that would cause rapid cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, a death that would appear upon external examination like a heart attack or a sudden medical emergency, rather than the obvious result of a deliberate attack. The specific toxin chosen was a modified version of a compound originally developed for medical research, but weaponized by Israeli intelligence technical services for use in covert operations. The compound worked by blocking specific receptors in the cardiac and respiratory systems, causing immediate disruption of heart rhythm and breathing that quickly progressed to complete system failure. The advantage of this particular agent was that it left minimal traces in the body that could be detected by standard autopsy procedures, and the traces that remained could be mistaken for naturally occurring compounds or the breakdown products of legitimate medicines, making it difficult for investigators to conclusively prove that death resulted from deliberate poisoning rather than natural causes. The delivery device was concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary prayer bead bracelet, an item that would be completely normal for a Muslim to wear during prayer, and which would attract no attention from guards or other congregants. The bracelet was constructed to be functionally identical to genuine prayer beads commonly used by devout Muslims, with the only difference being that one of the beads contained a small reservoir of toxin and a microneedle delivery system that could be activated by the wearer. The device was activated by the operative pressing specific beads in sequence, an activation that would be invisible to observers and which prepared the toxin for delivery, 3 mm in diameter. A needle that extended from the bracelet when the operative pressed it against the target's skin with sufficient pressure to ensure penetration. The needle's design was critical to the operation's success, as it had to be long enough to penetrate through clothing and into the target's skin where the toxin could enter the bloodstream, but short enough not to cause pain or a noticeable sensation that would alert the target to an attack. Engineers who developed the device thoroughly tested it to determine the optimal needle length and delivery pressure, using animals and human volunteers to establish parameters that would ensure reliable toxin delivery while minimizing the physical sensation the target would experience. The final design used a needle approximately 5 mm long, driven by a small spring mechanism providing consistent delivery pressure regardless of how firmly the operative pressed the device against the target. The operative chosen for the mission was a Mossad officer we will call Yusuf, a Palestinian Israeli who had been recruited into Israeli intelligence and who for years had built covers as a Hamas sympathizer and a devout Muslim. Yusuf's background allowed him to move within Palestinian society without arousing immediate suspicion, and his training in Israeli intelligence gave him the skills necessary to conduct covert operations while maintaining his cover. Yusuf had conducted previous operations in Gaza and the West Bank, operations that included intelligence gathering, recruiting sources, and occasional direct action missions against Hamas and Islamic Jihad targets. Yusuf's recruitment into Mossad occurred in the late 1990s, when he was approached by Israeli intelligence officers who identified him as a potentially valuable asset based on his background, his family connections in Gaza, and his personal characteristics that suggested he might be suited for intelligence work. Yusuf was motivated to work with Israeli intelligence for complex reasons that included both ideological factors and personal grievances, including disillusionment with Hamas, and with the Palestinian Authority leadership he perceived as corrupt and ineffective. His recruitment and training took over 2 years, during which he was taught intelligence tradecraft, including surveillance techniques, communication security, weapons handling, and the psychological preparation needed to conduct operations where discovery would lead to execution by Hamas security services, who would view him as a traitor deserving the harshest punishment. Preparation for the mosque assassination required Yusuf to establish a presence in Gaza City weeks before the operation, creating a plausible reason for his presence in the city, and establishing a routine of attending Friday prayers at various mosques, so his presence at the target mosque would not appear unusual or suspicious. Yusuf entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing, using identification documents that identified him as a merchant from Hebron conducting business in Gaza. A cover that was supported by actual commercial activity, Yusuf conducted to maintain his credibility and explain his presence in Gaza to anyone who might question his activities. The commercial cover involved Yusuf establishing relationships with merchants in Gaza dealing in construction materials and consumer goods. Relationships that provided both cover for his presence and opportunities to collect intelligence on economic conditions and on Hamas activity in the commercial sector. Yusuf attended Friday prayers at different mosques throughout July and early August, gradually moving toward the Al-Amari mosque, where intelligence indicated Shahada would be present for prayer on August 9. Visiting various mosques served multiple purposes, including allowing Yusuf to observe security procedures and understand how worshippers moved in the space, establishing a pattern that would make his presence at Al-Amari Mosque normal and unsuspicious, and allowing Yusuf to practice the movement and timing that would be necessary to approach Shahada during prayer and administer the toxin without attracting attention. During these reconnaissance visits to mosques, Yusuf paid particular attention to how Hamas guards screened congregants entering mosques where senior Hamas figures were present, noting what behavior or characteristics drew additional scrutiny and what allowed people to pass through security without questioning. He noticed that guards focused primarily on identifying individuals who seemed nervous or who carried items that could conceal weapons, paying less attention to individuals who appeared to be regular worshippers familiar with mosque protocols and who carried only items normal for prayer, including prayer beads, small Qurans, or prayer mats. Yusuf also noted the physical layout of various mosques, including the location of exits, positions where guards were typically stationed, and areas where crowd density during prayer would provide concealment for a close approach to targets. Intelligence on Shahada's presence at the Al-Amari Mosque on August 9 came from a human source inside Hamas that Mossad had cultivated for several years. A source who had access to Shahada's schedule and who provided information on his movements and activities. A source whose identity and position within Hamas remained classified, was recruited through a combination of financial incentives and ideological motivation. Becoming disillusioned with Hamas leadership and concluding that cooperation with Israeli intelligence better served Palestinian interests than continuing an armed conflict that caused enormous suffering to ordinary Palestinians. While Hamas leaders lived relatively comfortable lives and sent others to fight and die in attacks that achieved little strategic gain. The source's information on Shahada's mosque visit was considered highly reliable, based on previous reports that had proven accurate. But Mossad took additional precautions to confirm the information through other sources and through technical surveillance that monitored communication between Hamas personnel involved in Shahada's security arrangements. The confirmation process indicated that Shahada had indeed scheduled time to attend prayer at the Al-Amari Mosque on August 9, and that his bodyguards had conducted preliminary reconnaissance of the mosque to assess security conditions and plan their protective procedures during the prayer. On the morning of August 9, Yusuf received final authorization from Mossad headquarters to proceed with the operation. authorization that came after confirmation from the source that Shahada had not changed his plans and that he would be at the mosque for the afternoon prayer. The authorization was transmitted via an encrypted message that used a commercial cellular network, with the message appearing as an ordinary business text that would not attract attention from Palestinian security services monitoring communications for suspicious content. The coded message confirmed the operation was approved and provided final intelligence on security conditions at the mosque and Shahada's estimated time of arrival. Yusuf made final preparations, including testing the delivery device to ensure it functioned correctly, reviewing the plan and contingencies one last time, and conducting surveillance on the mosque to note security procedures and identify optimal positions and routes for the assassination and escape. Testing the device involved activating the mechanism to confirm the needle extended properly and that the toxin reservoir was correctly pressurized. Testing that was conducted in the privacy of Yusuf's safe house, where he could work unobserved. Testing confirmed the device functioned as intended and was ready for use in the operation. Yusuf arrived at the Al-Amari mosque approximately 30 minutes before the prayer began, a time that allowed him to enter with the initial flow of worshippers, rather than arriving after the prayer had already started, when latecomers might receive more attention from guards. Yusuf passed through an informal security check at the mosque entrance, where Hamas guards watched those entering and sometimes questioned individuals who seemed suspicious. But Yusuf's appearance and behavior as a devout congregant allowed him to enter without questioning or search. He carried only his prayer beads, which included the weaponized delivery device, and a small Quran he had purchased in Gaza that showed signs of regular use to support his cover as a devout Muslim. Inside the mosque, Yusuf positioned himself in a spot that would allow him to observe Shahada when he arrived, while not being so close that Hamas guards would notice unusual attention from Yusuf to their principal. The mosque filled quickly as the time for afternoon prayer approached. Hundreds of worshippers arranged themselves in rows facing the mihrab that indicated the direction of Mecca. The crowded conditions were tactically advantageous for the operation, as they would allow Yusuf to approach Shahada during the physical movements of prayer, with such proximity not appearing unusual or suspicious. Shahada arrived approximately 10 minutes before the prayer began, entering through a side entrance that was less crowded than the main entrance, and which allowed him to enter with less exposure to public observation. Shahada was accompanied by two bodyguards who positioned themselves several meters from him, close enough to respond if threats arose, but far enough that their security role was not immediately obvious to a casual observer. Shahada positioned himself in the third row from the front of the prayer hall, a position that gave him a good view of the imam who would lead the prayers, while placing him amid the congregation rather than at the edges where he might be more vulnerable to attack from outside the mosque. Once the prayer began, Yusuf moved from his initial position toward the area where Shahada was located, moving during the standing portions of the prayer when worshippers changed position, and when movement through the prayer hall would appear normal. Yusuf positioned himself in the row directly behind Shahada, a position that would allow him to lean forward and make contact with Shahada during the prostration portions of the prayer, when worshippers would be bent forward with heads close to the ground, and when physical contact between neighboring congregants would be common due to crowded conditions. The assassination occurred during the second prostration of the prayer, the moment when worshippers were bent forward, touching their foreheads to the ground in a gesture of submission to God. Yusuf leaned forward as if adjusting his position in the crowded row, bringing his hand into contact with the lower part of Shahada's back, where the toxin delivery device would penetrate through clothing and inject the chemical agent directly into Shahada's body. The contact lasted only a fraction of a second, long enough for the device to deliver its payload, but brief enough that Shahada would not register the contact as anything unusual in the context of the crowded prayer conditions. Yusuf immediately withdrew his hand and returned to a prayerful position, maintaining the appearance of a worshipper focused on prayers rather than any other activity. The toxin began affecting Shahada within seconds, though initial effects were internal and would not be immediately visible to observers. The chemical agent disrupted Shahada's cardiac and respiratory systems, causing his heart rhythm to become irregular and inducing labored breathing. effects that quickly progressed to complete cardiac arrest and respiratory failure. Shahada remained in the prostration position for several seconds longer than usual, a delay his bodyguards might have noticed if watching him closely, but which was not immediately obvious to other worshippers focused on their own prayers. When Shahada attempted to rise from prostration to continue the next portion of the prayer, he instead slumped forward. His body went limp as the effects of the toxin suppressed his ability to maintain consciousness or control his movements. The collapse caused immediate alarm among worshippers around Shahada, who initially assumed he had fainted or was experiencing a medical emergency, not realizing he was under attack. Bodyguards quickly moved toward Shahada, pushing through rows of worshippers to reach him and assess what was happening. Other worshippers also moved to help, creating confusion and a crowd around Shahada's position that made it difficult for anyone to clearly understand what was occurring. Yusuf remained in his position for several seconds, maintaining the appearance of a concerned congregant observing a medical emergency like everyone else around him. But as bodyguards reached Shahada, and as more worshippers gathered to see what was happening, Yusuf began moving away from the immediate area, exiting toward the mosque exit among other worshippers who were also moving away from the disturbance, or who were attempting to leave the mosque to summon medical help. The bodyguards attempted to revive Shahada, checking his breathing and pulse, and attempting to administer first aid. But the effects of the toxin were too far advanced for resuscitation to be effective. Within 2 minutes of the injection, Shahada was dead. His heart had stopped, and his respiratory system had completely failed. The bodyguards and other Hamas personnel realized Shahada was not merely unconscious but actually dead. A realization that triggered an immediate security response, including locking down the mosque and attempting to detain everyone present until investigators could determine what happened. But by the time Hamas guards moved to secure the mosque exits, Yusuf had already left the building, departing in the initial moments of confusion before security lockdown procedures were implemented. Yusuf walked away from the mosque at a normal pace, not running or otherwise drawing attention, blending with the crowds on the streets surrounding the mosque, and moving toward a safe house where he would remain concealed until evacuation from Gaza could be arranged. Inside the mosque, Hamas guards and Palestinian medical personnel attempted to determine what caused Shahada's death, examining his body for signs of wounds or injuries that might indicate he had been shot or stabbed. The examination found no obvious signs of violence, no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no other injuries that would immediately explain his sudden death. The tiny puncture point where the toxin delivery device penetrated his skin was so minuscule it was missed during the initial examination. And even if noticed, it might have been dismissed as insignificant, given it was too small to cause death by ordinary means. The absence of an obvious cause of death led Hamas to initially state that Shahada died from a heart attack or another natural medical emergency. A statement that was politically awkward for Hamas, as it suggested their military commander died from health problems rather than in combat or as a result of Israeli action. But Hamas guards remained suspicious that Shahada's death might be murder, despite the lack of clear evidence. Suspicion based on the timing and location of his death, and on the fact that Israeli intelligence had tried to eliminate Shahada for years and had strong motivation to continue those attempts. Hamas launched an extensive investigation into Shahada's death, conducting a detailed autopsy that discovered the tiny puncture wound, and that identified traces of chemical compounds in his tissues that were inconsistent with natural death. The investigation also included interrogating hundreds of worshippers who were present in the mosque, attempting to identify anyone whose behavior was suspicious or who could not adequately explain their presence at the prayer. Interrogations were conducted aggressively. Hamas security services used coercive methods, including detention, threats, and physical pressure to extract information from individuals suspected of having knowledge about the killing. The assassination of Salah Shahada inside the Al-Amari mosque demonstrated the extreme measures Mossad was prepared to take to eliminate high-value targets, conducting operations in places and under conditions most intelligence services would consider impossible or too risky. The operation succeeded due to the use of specialized assassination technology that left minimal evidence, thanks to thorough intelligence preparation that identified when and where the target would be vulnerable, and thanks to operational tradecraft that allowed the assassin to approach the target in crowded conditions and escape before a security response could be organized. The killing eliminated one of Hamas's most capable military commanders, but created controversy over Israel's willingness to conduct lethal operations inside religious sites during prayer. The operation raised complex questions about the permissible limits of counterterrorism operations, about whether religious sites should be considered off-limits for military action even when used by targets for protection, and about whether assassination methods that leave ambiguous evidence serve legitimate intelligence objectives or simply create plausible deniability that allows governments to avoid accountability for extrajudicial operations. If you found this detailed account of a covert intelligence operation compelling, please show your support by liking this video. Your engagement helps bring more in-depth historical and analytical content to light. Consider subscribing to the channel for future explorations of complex events from around the world. If you know others interested in history, intelligence, or international affairs, please share this video with them. Thank you for watching. Please share this video with them. Thank you for watching.